procure and deploy a PIV-Enabled PAC system. My name is Randy Vanderhoof, and I'm the Executive Director of the Secure Technology Alliance, formerly the Smart Card Alliance. This is the second in a series of webinars that we'll be bringing to the security industry. The first webinar was an introductory session on the planning of PAC's procurement and implementation. And today's webinar is being recorded and will be available for playback along with the presentation deck after the webinar has concluded. There will be time at the end for questions, so I encourage listeners to submit their questions using the user dashboard on your screen. I'll return at the end of the presentation to lead the Q&A and I encourage you to submit your questions to the speakers as they are presenting so that we have time to organize them in advance so we can get to as many of them as we have time for. Let me introduce the other presenters for today's webinar. Lars Suneborn is Director of Training Programs for the Alliance, and he's also the former chair of the Access Control Council. And prior to joining the Alliance, spent many years as a PAC system engineer, sales, and security expert for several global security organizations. Michael Kelley is Principal Electronic Security Systems Technical Specialist for Parsons Corporation. And William Bill Windsor is the IT Program Manager at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. All three of these gentlemen are active participants in the Access Control Council, one of the many industry councils within the Secure Technology Alliance. Next slide. So for those of you who may not be familiar with the Nology Alliance, here's a brief overview. So the mission of the organization is as a nonprofit, multi-industry association working to stimulate the understanding, adoption, and widespread application of secure solutions. We provide in a collaborative, member-driven environment, education and information about how smart cards, embedded chip technology, and related hardware and software can be adopted across the markets in the US. Now that's a pretty broad mission, but if you look on the right side of the screen, you'll see that the principal markets that we focus these activities towards include access control, authentication, healthcare, identity management, the Internet of Things, mobile, payments, and transportation. And so as a cross-industry member-supported organizations, we do the following things to educate and stimulate the market by bringing together stakeholders to effectively collaborate on promoting secure solutions, technology, and addressing industry challenges. We publish white papers, webinars, and workshops like this, and newsletters and position papers and web content on these topics. We create conferences and events to focus on specific markets and technology. We have an educational program including training and industry certifications, and provide networking opportunities for professionals to share ideas and knowledge and produce communications through our public relations, web resources, and social media to impact on the marketplace. Next slide. So in order to further provide insight into this particular industry council, the Access Control Council has a more specific focus, which is on accelerating the widespread acceptance, use, and application of secure technologies in various form factors for physical and logical access control. This group brings together in an open forum leading users and technologists from both the public and private sectors. And on the right side, you see some of the many examples of what this group have produced, including white papers, reports, and guidance documents on various ID credentialing technologies and implementations. That includes the FICAM roadmap and implementation guidance, understanding the FIPS 201 standards for use and access control, guidance for architecture and engineers to implement PACs in non-government systems, the role of smart cards and use of biometrics in access control systems, logical access control, and the use of PIV credentialing in mobile devices. So now I'm going to turn this over to Lars Suneborn, who's going to talk about the National Training Center. Lars?
Thank you very much, Randy. My name is Lars, and I am the Director of Training Programs for the Secure Technology Alliance. Most often you can find me in our National Center for Advanced Payment and Identity Security in Crystal City, Virginia, and that is where we have our Secure Technology Alliance Educational Institute. The certifications that we offer are CSCIP, that stands for Certified Smart Card Industry Professional. That is a generic identity verification and identity vetting, identity management and credentialing and issuance session. And we focus there on the security of identity data as they are on unsecure identity credential, lifecycle management, and some use cases. The second one that we have here that has been very active in the past few years is Certified Smart Card Information Industry Professional for Payments. And that is similar in that it uses secure technology smart cards for payment applications. It is focused on the payment industry. It focuses on the new chip-based payment and credential cards that we have, payment terminals manufactured, payment processing companies, payment standards, and we have a global audience for that. We have another one that is called Certified Smart Card Industry Professional that is focused on the U.S. government. And that is on U.S. government identity vetting, identity credentialing, focus on PIV and the PIV-I credential and CIV credentials. And we talk about how the background investigations are doing, how the systems must consume these cards with the various authentication mechanisms and validation mechanisms that have been stood up. We talk about the federal bridge, the PKI cryptography, that is the foundation for that. And we talk about how the systems that consumes these credentials, physical access control and logical access control, coexist. And we also talk about how this system executes the policy enforcement that is part of this. We also have a certification that is called Certified System Engineer ICAM-PAX, CSCIP. And that is a multi-day certification, and that deals with system engineering, system engineering people that are going to participate in federal access control system projects. GSA have an approval process for systems and equipment, and we have an approval product for people. So we have a APL for people and we have an APL for equipment. A growing number of agencies are using this as a prerequisite for company to even participate in bids. And we run one of these sessions here at least once a month. And from time to time, we also do this on a corporate level and where we take them on the road. And before I turn this over to Mike Kelley, I would also like to acknowledge Mark Dale from XTech, who was instrumental in developing the content for this course and for other sessions that we're going to produce here today and in the next future. So I would like to turn this over to Bill Windsor.
Thank you, Lars. Hate to disappoint, but it's up. I'm up next. Mike Kelley's right behind me, guys. So good afternoon, everybody. I'm Bill Windsor. I am an IT program manager at the Department of Homeland Security. My role here is overseeing the development of PACS modernization for all the physical access assets within the department. We're going to start out today with talking about what constitutes compliance. Compliance begins with the card or the credential we use to represent our identity. In this case, we're talking about PIV cards. Issuance of this type of strong credential is based on auditable practices used to verify an individual's identity. That verification process includes a national agency check with the inquiries, also known as a NACI. A NACI is a background investigation primarily for federal employees and contractors who will not have access to classified information. This investigation is appropriate for positions designated as public trust positions that require responsible, trustworthy employees and federal contractors. PIV cards employ the use of laser etching, holographic images, and other security features as a means to prevent counterfeiting. On the inside of the card, we use strong encryption. We'll talk about authentication in a little bit. To protect the data that we store inside that card. This also prevents opportunities to exploit the card, to exploit opportunities for identity fraud, and tampering. Use of standards for writing and reading the PIV card is a key enabler to supporting rapid, strong authentication capability, an act attributable to the second chevron below, focusing on our ability to authenticate a presented credential. PIV cards are only issued by validated government providers or government issuers. NIST has established a process called the PIV Credential Issuers Requirements, which can be found in NIST Special Publication 879. Providers must be audited and achieved an approved issuance practice before they can issue the first card. As we look at differences in how we characterize facilities and risk assessments, this quote from HSPD 12 addresses the need for a standard that provides a credential capable of supporting a range of systems in the workplace, whether it's a single or multi-factor requirement. Chevron 3 focuses on the act of authorizing the access request. Building on the authenticity of the presented PIV card, we must also establish the individual's need to achieve access to a facility. Presenting a PIV should not result in an automatic general access request being granted. Risk assessments and mitigation strategies should be factored to assure protection of a facility is being maintained. We will talk more about the act of authorization in our series of webinars. Next slide, please. Today's session will focus on facility characteristics and risk. Knowing our facilities and understanding the opportunity and the potential for risk to be taken advantage of, we were able to realize the opportunity for threat, some of the key factors in our project planning efforts. Assessed risk provides us the greatest opportunity to develop mitigation strategies. I sum this up by saying, know your location, determine your destination, then chart the course. Next slide, please. The Interagency Security Committee, or the ISC, was established by Executive Order 12977 following the bombing of the Alfred P. Murrah building in Oklahoma City, requiring federal departments and agencies to develop security policies for federal facilities and requiring compliance for all executive branch agencies. Executive Order 13286 reassigned the ISC oversight from General Services Administration to the Department of Homeland Security. Factors we assess with are based on the following. Mission criticality addresses the business or functions within a given facility and its ability to sustain national essential functions. This may also be seen as the facility's importance in performing an agency's mission. Symbolism is based on the recognition or attractiveness as a target and the consequences of an event. The symbolic value is first based on the external appearance or publicized operation within the facility, indicating it's a U.S. government facility. Terrorists, both foreign and domestic, often seek to strike at symbols of the United States, its democracy, defense, and capitalism. Facility population is the total number of employees and contractors in government space for all occupying agencies within that facility. It is recognized that terrorist organizations value carrying out acts of terrorism that result in mass casualties. Populations should be a major consideration when assessing risk. Facility size is determined by the total square footage of all federally occupied space in that facility, including cases where an agency with real property authority control has some other space, such as a storage area or a loading dock, that needs to be accounted for as well. As is international published risk assessment standard RA 1-2015, in August of 2015, focus on the effects of risk. The standard provides guidance for establishing a risk assessment program and conducting individual risk assessments consistent with ISO 31000-2009, risk management principles and guidelines. Conducting risk assessments for risk and resilient-based management system standards for the discipline of risk, resilience, security, crisis, continuity, and recovery management. It also describes the process for conducting risk assessments consistent with the plan, do, check, act models. Last, it provides the informational basis necessary for decision makers to make informed decisions about managing risk. This as-is standard is available free for as-is members. Non-members will be charged a fee to access the document. Next slide, please. Assets can include facilities, equipment, the agency's workforce. While we focus more on the non-person aspect of this part of the conversation, we begin by first defining what is that facility. A facility may be a single building, a campus of buildings, or a room. Federal facilities are defined as government, leased, or owned facilities within the United States and its territories, occupied by its federal employees and contractors for non-military activity. Governance of the federally occupied facility is controlled by federal occupying and tenants having funding authority. And a single tenant facility, the lone federal department or agency with that funding authority becomes the decision maker for that facility's security. When occupied by two or more federal tenants with funding authority, a Federal Security Committee, or FSC, should be established to make those facility decisions performed equally. Environmental factors should also be considered, such as adjacent facilities, mass transit, public access, terrain, as well as roadways that should be incorporated into your facility assessment. Often these factors are not in our direct control, therefore any perceived risk can be documented and mitigated. Assets might also be defined as equipment, materials, or information, serving some value or investment to perform an agency's mission. When determining the asset value, we must look at total replacement cost and what impact it may have on the mission in the event of a catastrophe. Is that asset solely owned, or is it a shared resource? Is it unique, or is it one of many? All considerations. Loss of asset may also result in the inability to perform the mission critical or essential functions. Loss in productivity, personal safety threats, unplanned repair or replacement cost, as well as potential loss in confidence or reputation. Next slide, please. When assessing a facility, all these factors must be considered in performing a sound assessment. This is a key activity to understanding and mitigating potential risk. Are you exposed to public transit? Does your facility play an administrative role in serving the public? Is the facility a data center? If so, what sensitivities are added to protect the data and the infrastructure housed within? Is it a medical facility serving the public but still requiring some form of restricted access inside? Transportation and maintenance facilities may house vehicles or equipment, adding in a potential variety of access points such as driveways or fence gates, as well as areas of separation to be considered, areas such as storage lots, equipment depots, etc. Law enforcement or intelligence agencies are likely going to require higher levels of protection due to the nature of their business. Next slide, please. This picture represents a sample of what a government facility might look like. In assessing this facility, my work begins with the exterior, looking at the entrances, whether it's a doorway for foot traffic or a driveway to the parking garage. As we go inside, the majority of a facility shows controlled access. Using a PIV card to gain that access would be my number one focus. NIST Special Publication 800-116, titled A Recommendation for the Use of PIV Credentials in PACS, introduces the concept of controlled, limited, and exclusion areas to employ risk-based PIV authentication mechanisms for differing areas within a facility. This example depicts the three variations. Controlled, shown in green, represents an area requiring a single factor of authentication. Use of a PIV card through a contactless read, we would authenticate the request by using the Card Authentication Certificate, or CAC, as a form of granting that access. Limited, shown in orange, represents an area requiring two factors of authentication. Authentication in this situation would occur through a contact read, presentation of the PIV card, and the PKI stored within the PIV card, the PIV authentication certificate, would be validated. The second factor in this is the use of the PIN and authentication of that PIV certificate. Last is the exclusion area, shown in red. This would require three factors of authentication. Authentication would occur through a contact card read, presentation of that PIV, use of the PIV authentication inside that card, PIN entry included, and lastly, a biometric check in the form of a fingerprint or iris. This approach also represents how basic layering of security could function in a facility. Some additional considerations to note when including layering security to defeat potential risk. While we may not necessarily see this in a government building serving in a public capacity, facilities deemed to have higher risk might incorporate the use of secondary access authentication request. The use of hardware devices such as man traps or turnstiles are often used to help mitigate that risk. Next slide, please. Location of assets must also be known to provide the most appropriate protection. Geographical location is often a contributing factor. Understanding events that occurred in the area and use of mitigation strategies play a significant role in protecting our assets. Our adversaries often capitalize on easily accessible targets. To what and whom are we protecting against? Natural events such as hurricanes and tornadoes should be considerations in how a facility is built, as well as the supporting infrastructure. Power likely being the main focus. However, roadways and drainage are also key factors. Man-made events can be quite different. We're limited by what history has shown us. Use of an airplane as a projectile or a truck loaded with fertilizer fashioned to be a devastating bomb. The IC defines threat in 5 sub-factors. Nature of the tenant. How is it seen by the public? Is it adversarial or is it cooperative or friendly? Nature of the mission. Is the mission controversial? Past or present threats to this agency? Past or present threats to other agencies within the facility? Crime statistics. Often factored out of local, state, and federal statistics to determine is the facility located in a high, moderate, or low crime area. I'm now going to hand you off to Mike Kelley, who will discuss our adversaries and risk. Mike?
Thanks, Bill. Good afternoon, everyone. Glad you could be here with us this afternoon. Certainly what Bill mentioned about the man-made and the natural threats are both important. I don't want to downplay the natural threats and the overall security posture, but we're really talking about physical access control here today. So I want to pick up where he left off and drill a little deeper into the man-made threats. Specifically adversary motivation and capability. Understanding this helps you figure out what assets are likely to be attacked and why. It will also give you some insight into how an attack may be carried out and how far you'll need to go to deny a successful attack. In other words, it's going to let you efficiently reduce your risk. The intelligence community originally coined the term MICE to describe 4 factors that motivate a person to spy. It can also be used to apply to other types of adversaries. Money is the most common motivating factor, and it's the easiest one to understand. Adversaries are simply looking for some sort of financial gain by taking an asset from you or preventing you from using that asset. Reducing or eliminating the potential for financial gain mitigates the risk from this type of adversary. An ideological adversary is motivated by a cultural belief, a political opinion, national allegiance, or a religious belief. Unless you happen to share their positions, it's going to be hard to see something from their point of view. So it's difficult to determine how far you'll need to go to deny an attack from this type of adversary. The C in MICE is for coercion. This is where an individual, a friend, or family member is threatened with injury or death unless they participate in an attack. They may also be threatened with the release of embarrassing information, such as information about an extramarital affair or an undiscovered crime. The target of coercion really has no loyalty to the extortionist, so it's very easy to turn them, and they will turn very easily if they have the opportunity. The fourth human motivator is ego. The adversary may feel they're entitled to somehow right a perceived wrong. They also may feel they're too smart or too good to be caught, or that their act will have a substantial impact. This gives them a sense of importance or significance. They cease to be a minor functionary. An adversary motivated by ego often feels like a sense of superiority over coworkers they believe they're outwitting. When you're assessing capabilities, you want to look at your facility from the perspective of a potential adversary. How would you carry out an attack? And what would you need to be successful? What tactics, techniques, or procedures would you use? Would you rely on stealth? Is deception a possibility? Depending on the asset, overt physical force may be required. No matter what tactics are used, every attack requires resources. How much money is required? What knowledge is required to defeat the countermeasures or circumvent the procedures you've put in place? Are any special tools, materials, or skills required? The list of required knowledge, tools, materials, and special skills will be fairly large if the facility incorporates security in depth. Once you've done your assessment, see how it stacks up with what you know about potential adversary capabilities. The closer the match, the more likely an adversary is to attempt an attack. Keep in mind that adversaries may adjust their tactics to fit the resources they have available to them and the assets they're targeting. On one end of the scale, large state-sponsored organizations will have access to a broad range of resources. On the other side of the scale, individuals, or lone wolves as some people call them, really don't have access to anywhere near that level of resources. You can get information about tactics, techniques, and procedures of larger or more organized groups from reports of previous attacks, but it's harder to find out information about smaller, less organized groups. One of the best resources available to you is provided by the ISC. Their risk management process standard includes an appendix called the Design Basis Threat Report. This is an FOUO document that is regularly updated to provide current information about potential adversaries and their capabilities. And you see the link here on your screen. Next slide, please. So along with assessing potential adversaries, you need to assess your current countermeasures. This webinar series is about PACs, but the PACs doesn't provide security by itself. It needs to work with and complement other countermeasures, policies, and procedures. I highlighted currently here because this is the starting point of your project. You need to know where you're at before you figure out where you're going and how you're going to get there. That all comes later in the process. Taking a fresh look at your current countermeasures will also give you a chance to identify pieces that may still be useful as long as they're effective, working properly, and still supportable. As we mentioned earlier, start at the perimeter and work inward. Look at the physical barriers, the walls, doors, fences, gates, etc. Look at the vehicle and personnel access control points. How many employees pass through them? How many visitors? Are those numbers fairly consistent, or are they peak periods throughout the day? Are there special events that cause those numbers to peak at for other reasons, other times? Know what credentials are accepted at the access control points and what technologies they use. For example, magnetic stripe or proximity. Office of Management Budget Memorandum 0524 gives examples of individuals who may or may not have a PIV card. These include short-term guest researchers, volunteers, intermittent, temporary, or seasonal employees, eligible beneficiaries at DoD and Department of State facilities, and other occasional visitors you'd normally issue temporary identification to. Although it's not specifically mentioned, you should include employees who lose their card or forget it at home. You'll need to make sure you know what credentials these people currently use so you can make sure that they keep their ability to access the facility as you implement your project. The other thing to remember is that HSPD 12 only applies to the executive branch, so you may also need to know how legislative or judicial branch personnel gain access to your facility. From the systems perspective, the age and condition of the PACs will determine what can or cannot be used going forward, and it may help you to prioritize the work going forward. In some cases, the age or condition of the system may make a wholesale replacement your only option. Assuming it's still functioning and supportable, know what hardware, firmware, and software versions are currently being used. Any components that are going to be reused must be compatible with new components. Your PACS integrator should be able to help you with this. You also need to look at the condition of the supporting infrastructure to determine if any upgrades will be required as part of or in conjunction with your project. You may need to coordinate with facility management or engineering personnel regarding space, power, or HVAC requirements, and with information technology personnel regarding network communication or cybersecurity. Adding these skill sets to your project team early on will limit the surprises and improve the odds of success. Don't forget to review the current accreditation package and authority to operate. It may provide you with insight into issues that you should be planning to resolve. Know whether the ATO was approved using the newer risk management framework controls, which give you more flexibility in what controls have to be applied and how they have to be applied, as long as you're suitably mitigating your risks. Finally, determine what other systems are currently interfaced with the PACS. Common systems include CCTV or surveillance, intrusion detection, elevator control, and fire alarm. Larger organizations may use a physical security information management system, or PSIM, to centralize security response command control from several facilities. Standalone facilities often use the monitoring applications provided with the PACS system. In some cases, these other functions I just mentioned are actually provided through the PACS software instead of a separately integrated system. Next slide, please. So your existing PACS may not be at the end of its life cycle. It might even be up to date with the latest hardware, firmware, and software revisions, but that doesn't mean it's effective. The PACS as a tool has to work together with the security personnel and the procedures they follow to be effective. Look at the system logs and speak with the operators to look for areas to improve. There's some questions you can ask to help establish a baseline for your project. Some of them tie back directly to HSPD 12. Does the existing PACS electronically authenticate credentials fast enough for the throughput? One of the things we found is that it's a shock for the users to transition from a legacy credential where they're used to placing a proximity card on a reader and not even breaking stride as a pass-through turnstile. You'll be slowing that down, even with a single-factor PIV authentication mechanism, which is somewhere in the neighborhood of 1.5 to 2 seconds. Multi-factor authentication is even slower. Does the existing PACS deny access to individuals presenting revoked, lost, stolen, expired, cloned, altered, or otherwise fraudulent credentials? Legacy systems generally issue their own credentials, so there may not be many indicators of problems. One thing I would look for is orphaned records. I've done a number of projects where you find significant numbers of credentials in the system that have either expired or haven't been used in a long time. It's also not uncommon to find identity records for individuals that are no longer affiliated with the organization or no longer need to access the facility. Look at the numbers of identity and credential records in the system and make sure they somewhat agree with the numbers, the demographic information you picked up on earlier. If they don't, it's an indication that the data will either need to be discarded or scrubbed before you can use it. Does the existing PACS deny access to individuals with valid credentials but no proper authorization? If a lot of people are being denied access, you'll need to decide if the authorization rules at the access control point are still appropriate. Security isn't always convenient. If something If your organization makes operational changes, but the PACS doesn't reflect those new operations or makes them harder, you'll lose the balance between security and convenience. Employees will be more likely to disregard or even defeat some of the mechanisms you've put in place if they're inconvenienced too greatly. Does the PACS currently detect events such as invalid cards, access denials, forced or held doors, equipment tampers, supervision errors, or power and communication failures? If not, there's an opportunity to include these in planning for your project. Not only does the PACS need to detect these events, it needs to accurately enunciate them in response to responsive personnel in a timely fashion. Not all events require a response by security personnel. Sometimes it's more appropriate for maintenance personnel to respond where events indicate a PACS may not be functioning correctly. The PACS configuration and its operating procedures should differentiate between these two types of events. Finally, does the existing PACS support multi-factor authentication? Something you have, something you know, and something you are. Card plus PIN is most commonly used multi-factor mechanism in legacy systems, but the PIV card supports options that provide better authentication assurance. This is a good time to see if multi-factor authentication is still required and consider the supported PIV mechanisms. All these questions point to how effective your PACS is at reducing the risks to the facility. Documenting these types of issues will help justify allocating resources to correct them. Next slide, please. So changing gears for a second, I want to mention the legal and regulatory requirements. Remember, we said one of our goals was compliance, but that involves a lot more than just meeting the requirements of HSP 212 and the standards that came from it. You need to assess how your organization is complying with all laws and regulations as part of your planning. Many of these compliance requirements can be traced back to federal law. For example, the Federal Information Security Modernization Act, or FISMA. That's the law that authorizes NIST to issue Federal Information Processing, or FIPS standards. And it establishes a baseline for information system certification and accreditation. Another example is the Privacy Act of 1974. Your PACS system stores personally identifiable information, or PII. The Privacy Act sets out specific public disclosure requirements to describe what information is being collected, why it's being collected, how it's being collected, how it's stored and protected, and the conditions it can be released under. This information must all be provided in a Systems of Record notice that must be published in the Federal Register for public comment. This can be a lengthy process, so you have to consult with your agency's legal department or privacy office to ensure you're properly accounting for this in your planning. The Department of Justice Civil Rights Division issues design standards that must be followed to comply with the Americans with Disabilities Act. For PACS, this will include things like reader height and distance from obstructions, clear widths for access portals, and standards for conveying information to individuals with hearing or vision impairments. State and local laws may impose additional requirements for things like technician licensing and building permits, but the applicability of those requirements will vary depending on whether the facility is federally owned or commercially leased. You'll need to comply with regulations issued by your agency and other agencies that have received delegated authority. For example, the Office of Management and Budget has updated the Circular A-130. It includes requirements for managing information system budget allocations. The General Services Administration has been assigned responsibility for testing and approving PIV-Enabled PACS components and establishing requirements to certify PACS integrators. FISMA gives NIST the authority to issue requirements for cybersecurity and PIV technical specifications in the form of Federal Information Processing Standards. The Department of Homeland Security issues requirements that are binding on all agencies, and its role as the chair of the Interagency Security Committee. Certain assets like weapons and ammunition, medicine, pharmaceuticals, critical infrastructure such as electrical, communication, or HVAC may have special protection requirements. For example, Intelligence Community Directive 705 provides requirements for the protection of areas that store or process classified information. In addition to binding regulations that they issue, both NIST and the ISC publish best practices that you may find useful. These usually come in the form of special publications at NIST. Many of these documents include best practices or a recommendation in the title to differentiate them from binding regulations. Finally, industry associations such as the Secure Technology Alliance, ASIS International, and the Security Industry Association publish security-related best practices and guidelines. Next slide, please. So I'll spend a few minutes. I want to show you a three-step process that uses all the information you've gathered up to this point to establish and prioritize the risks to your facility. Risk is really a product of probability multiplied by the consequence. In some places, you'll find a reference to vulnerability as a third element. From my perspective, vulnerability simply raise or lower the probability. So just using the two elements makes this easier to use and understand. The first step is to list all the threats to the facility. The order isn't important here. Just list them as they're identified. In this example, I use some of the threats from the ISC Design Basis Threat Report. Each of them can be broken down into smaller categories. For example, criminal activity can be broken down into assault, kidnapping, robbery, theft, vandalism, civil disturbance, and workplace violence. Explosive events can be broken down into parcel, person-borne, or vehicle-borne IEDs. Unauthorized entry can be broken down into forced, surreptitious, covert threats. Obviously, the more detailed you make it, the more threats you'll have. But everything is ranked relatively. And you can always adjust the scale of a graphic like this or of a tool like this as you need to. Next slide, please. So in the second step, you can rank each of the steps you identified in the relative order of probability that they're likely to occur in, from most to least likely, and plot them on the vertical or left side axis of the chart. Remember to consider the current but not future countermeasures into the probability ranking. The ranking I used here is just an example. It doesn't reflect the probability to your specific facility. And you'll see how the order is shifted around. In this case, unauthorized entry, or D, is the most probable of the threats that I identified. Next slide, please. So in the final step, you rank each of the threats in terms of relative consequence and move them along the horizontal axis of the chart. Again, the ranking here I used here is only an example. It doesn't reflect consequence to your specific facility or mission. When you're done, you'll have a chart that shows relative risks to your facility. The risks that are closer to the upper right of the chart should be a higher priority for you to mitigate, and you should devote more resources to those than risks that are closer to the lower left chart. If you actually need a number, you can multiply the probability and the consequence scores to obtain a risk value. That's the number you see to the right of each of the threats I listed. Next slide. Now that you've identified and prioritized the risks to your facility, you can begin identifying specific countermeasures to mitigate those risks. I've said this several times in the webinar, but it's a key point to remember. Risk can't be eliminated, it can only be reduced. One of the tools I recommend is Appendix B to the ISC Risk Management Process Standard. It's titled Countermeasures. It's another FOUO document that provides methods you can employ to mitigate risk. You can choose to reduce the consequence through things like redundancy or insurance. You can also choose to reduce the likelihood of an undesirable event by restricting access to sensitive areas or materials. You can require higher levels of identity and credential assurance. NIST recently released Digital Identity Guidelines, Special Publication 800-63-3. This revision includes separate identity and authentication levels of assurance, both having 3 tiers. It replaces what most of you are familiar with, which is the level of assurance, the 4-tier level of assurance that was published in 863-2. If you haven't, I highly recommend you reviewing this document. We've given you a lot of information during this session. Our hope is that you came away with the tools you need to assess and prioritize the risks to your facility, identify the appropriate countermeasures to mitigate those risks, and select the appropriate authentication mechanisms that will complement your overall security design as recommended in Special Pub 800-116. Everything we've talked about here will be used to establish a solid scope of work for your project. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Lars, who'll tell you what's coming up in the future sessions. Lars?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mike. And next slide, please. So here we see the remainder of our session series. Session number 3, that will be conducted on January 11th, and that talks about establishing the project scope. That will cover topics such as identify what risk will be mitigated, determine how effectiveness will be measured, and identify potential solutions, and some potential service providers. That session will be conducted by Steve Rogers, Mark Steffler, and Adam Chain. Session number 4, that talks about developing procurement strategy. That will be conducted on February 22nd, and that talks on things such as determine responsibilities for design and installation and configuration, standards, procurement vehicles such as GSA Schedule 70 and GSA Schedule 84, and draft contract documents. That will be conducted by Daryl Hendricks and Jason Rosen. Daryl Hendricks from GSA and Jason Rosen from the U.S. Capitol Police. Session number 5, that deals with the implementation of the solution. And that will talk about establish implementation schedule, developing monitoring and reporting plan for issues coming up during the installation, finalize the system design and compliance with the various regulations, testing, training of the local system operators, and cutover. That session will be conducted by Dave Helbach and Adam Chain, and that will be done on March 15th. Session number 6, that will be the last one of our series, and that is a panel discussion. That is a free panel discussion, and we will have members there from federal agencies. We will have members participating in this from system integrators and system manufacturers, and discuss the lessons learned. I think that will be a very interesting session, and that will be conducted on April 19th. Next slide, please. And what we have here is a higher outline of the different sessions that we have ahead of us according with the dates. So session number 3 here, you see what target audiences we have tailored that for. Session number 4, that will be tailored to the following audiences here. For instance, you see here executive sponsors. They are one of the key stakeholders there that we think should participate in all of these sessions. Session number 5, you see a list here of the target audiences that we think will be beneficial from this. And session number 6, that's the last one of our series, the lessons learned. And as you see here, I think all the target audiences here will be participating in this. And with this, I'd like to flip over to the next slide and turn this over to Randy Vanderhoof for question and answers.
Great, thank you, Lars, and also thank you, Michael Kelley and Bill Windsor, for the excellent work you did today and your presentations. Here is their contact information in case any of you would like to reach out to them directly or submit any questions to the team as a whole. We've got a few minutes left to take some questions. Again, if you would like to submit a question, please use the question bar on your dashboard for the GoToWebinar and send that to us, and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can. The first question is for Bill, and Bill's questioner wants to know, it was based on your slide number 13 where you had the diagram of the buildings and access areas. Why do we differentiate the areas within our buildings, and why not secure the entire building at a higher level of vulnerability? Bill, we're not hearing you in case you are speaking and you're on mute.
I apologize, Randy. I inadvertently disconnected myself.
Okay. Did you hear the question?
Technology. No, unfortunately, I did not.
A simple question is, why do we differentiate the areas within the buildings for our PAC systems, and why not just secure the building at a higher level of vulnerability?
Sure, good question. First consideration is we always place around the vulnerability and in our mitigation strategies we employ. When we deploy a complete facility at a higher level, we end up driving up cost. We also create the opportunity for longer lines, congestion, if you will. And it really provides no great overall value to facilitating an agency's mission. The basic mission is always going to be one of the critical factors in deciding what the security decisions to be. And it also goes into what becomes the overall facility security level determination, making those initial decisions for what sort of access control and levels of authentication that are necessary to gain access to the main facility.
Okay, thank you. Next question is from Mike's presentation. You mentioned that there were some people who are not required to have a PIV card, but may still need to get into a federal facility. Can you talk about some of the options to address that issue?
Yeah, sure. There's a couple different ways to approach this, and the first question you have to ask is, are any of those individuals going to be unescorted? There's a lot bigger risk if somebody's going to be in your facility without having received the same level of vetting and without that same level of authentication, since they don't have a PIV card. A couple of the things that you can look at would be to implement locally issued credentials that are PIV interoperable or PIV compatible. Subtle differences between the two, but those will be compatible with your systems, and then you can put your own processes in place to be able to control the issuing. And the biggest difference is that those credentials just will not be trusted anywhere else. The other part of that you have to ask yourself is, depending on how many visitors you process a year, whether you can afford to issue those cards in a personalized manner with names, pictures, and everything, or whether you want to try to reuse them. And then you'll have to figure out exactly how you want to assign privileges to those cards, assign and remove privileges to those cards if they're going to be authenticating through your access control points.
Okay, thank you. This next question could be either Mike or Bill. The presentation describes requirements for facility security, but what if you already have an access control system in place? And how do you determine whether or not the current system is sufficient or not?
So, Mike, I'll take the first stab at this, and then please jump in. So my job at DHS is looking at exactly that. Some of you may realize DHS has been around for a number of years, and as such, we've occupied and we've secured up, if you will, some of those facilities. The unfortunate part is these systems that are put in place often are aging systems that are relying on older, outdated technology. The challenge that I face head on is our ability to have strong authenticatable credentials. The older systems generally do not support the ability to do a PIV check, if you will, and perform any form of PKI validation. Some of the products that we do come across, some of the products that are deployed in DHS, actually do have migration paths where they can work with a vendor to do some software updates and some hardware updates. But generally speaking, we look directly at that system to determine its state and then the associated hardware to see what it can support.
Right, and Bill, I would add one of the other things to look at is look at one of the big red flags for me if I look at the facility and I'm looking at the equipment in the facility is the presence of proprietary technologies. The PACS industry as a whole has been slow to become standards-based, and you still see quite a fair amount of proprietary equipment out there. That trend is changing, so I look for standards-based. The more pieces of your existing PACS that you have that are standards-based, the more likely that you'll be able to come up with some way to integrate pieces and reuse some of those pieces.
Great point, Mike. Thank you.
Yeah, this sounds actually like a similar question to what you were just talking about, Mike. Says we are using PIV cards at our facility, and we didn't have to make any significant changes to our old access control system. It is reading the CHUID number from the card. Recently, I was informed that this does not meet requirements. So what do we need to do?
Well, right now, the CHUID authentication mechanism still is authorized, but it has zero assurance with it. And NIST has announced that when the next revision of 201, FIPS 201 comes out, that it will actually be removed. It'll take some time to get all the cards fully capable with other authentication mechanisms. And in a physical security environment, the most likely replacement is the CAK, or the card authentication key. The biggest issue you can have there is if you have to accept any Department of Defense CAC cards, because those cards are not on there yet. I question or make sure you understand exactly what you're looking at when you say you're using CHUID authentication mechanism. A couple of things that we've seen is cards that are reading readers that are reading the CHUID off the container without actually checking the digital signature of that container. That's one of the biggest pieces. It performs much faster, but there's a risk involved there too, because you can't confirm the authenticity of the data in the container. So I'd be looking primarily the one-for-one replacement. I'd be looking for card readers that support CAK authentication mechanism and the back end supporting panels.
Okay, thanks, Mike. I think we have time for one or two more questions. Bill, this question's for you. I have a PIV card. Does that mean that I can use it to get into any federal building?
It sounds like a great thing to have happen, but unfortunately that doesn't work. It sort of contradicts the use of these credentials. While these cards do serve as a form of a strong authenticatable token to enable access, it really becomes the first part of the request in granting a person access. We must also be able to validate that request when I do present that card. Some of the facilities that we do visit often have an open approach to their access. Places where there may be shops inside of a building, a bank, a credit union, that sort of a thing. Often we'll just use a PIV card to validate an individual's identity. That asserted PIV card still provides them a means of doing a PKI validation to make sure I'm still in good standing and that credential is in a good standing state.
Okay, I think we've got to wrap up here. Thank you very much for, again, Bill and Mike and Lars for today's presentation. Thank you, audience, for participating. And as a reminder, the webinar has been recorded and it will be made available for playback along with the presentation deck after the webinar has concluded. So please look for an email message from the Secure Technology Alliance with that link and information on how to access the webinar. And please mark your calendars for the upcoming webinars in the series. And we look forward to having you back again to participate very soon. Thank you all and have a great day.